What you need to understand about what unfolded in Davos over the last 2 days is not what the headlines are telling you. The real story isn't about a deal or a framework or a claimed victory. It's about contrast, about timing, about two leaders stepping onto the same stage in the same room, speaking to the same global audience, and revealing two radically different understandings of how power actually works in 2026. Set the scene. Davos, Switzerland, late January, snow-covered mountains, private jets lining the runway, executives, ministers, central bankers, heads of state all packed into one of the most influential gatherings on the planet. The World Economic Forum has always been a place where signals are sent, where tone matters as much as substance, where words ripple outward into markets, alliances, and policy rooms across the world. Within a span of less than 24 hours, two speeches were delivered there that could not have been more different in intent or consequence. One clarified where the world is heading. The other exposed how badly one man had misread it. On Tuesday, the Canadian Prime Minister walked onto that stage. Mark Carney is not a politician who relies on slogans or spectacle. His authority comes from something far more unsettling to people who prefer bluster, competence. Before entering politics, he ran the Bank of Canada. Then he ran the Bank of England. No one else in modern history has held both roles. When he talks about capital flows, financial leverage, systemic risk, or geopolitical power, he isn't theorizing. He's describing machinery he helped operate. So when he began speaking, the room listened, not politely, intently. Carney didn't waste time with optimism or ceremonial language. He didn't pretend the system was wobbling or under strain. He said, "The system that governed international relations since the end of the Second World War is finished. Not fading, not evolving, finished. What we are living through," he said, "is not a transition, but a rupture, a clean break, a tearing of the framework that held things together for decades." That word mattered. Rupture implies damage that cannot simply be patched. It suggests that returning to the way things were is not an option. And everyone in that room understood exactly why he chose it. But what made the speech extraordinary wasn't the diagnosis, it was what followed. Carney didn't mourn the old order, he didn't romanticize it. He acknowledged something many leaders avoid saying out loud: the so-called rules-based system was always selective. The strongest countries bent the rules when it suited them. Trade enforcement was uneven. International law carried different weight depending on who was accused and who was harmed. The system worked not because it was fair, but because enough countries believed the benefits outweighed the costs. Then he explained why that belief no longer holds. He spoke about what he called the illusion of mutual benefit through integration. The idea that deeper economic and political integration automatically makes everyone safer and richer. That assumption collapses, he said, when integration stops being a partnership and starts becoming a mechanism of control, when access turns into leverage, when dependency becomes vulnerability. At that point, the subtext was no longer subtle. He addressed what he called middle powers, countries that are not superpowers but are far from insignificant, nations with real economies, real militaries, real diplomatic weight, but not enough strength to stand alone against giants. Canada, France, Germany, Australia, Japan. He told them bluntly that neutrality and passivity are illusions. In a world where power is increasingly transactional, absence from the table doesn't make you safe. It makes you expendable. The line that followed landed hard because it wasn't rhetorical. If you're not seated at the table, you're what's being served. No one needed him to explain the context. At that very moment, the President of the United States was openly threatening a NATO ally. Greenland had been reduced to a bargaining chip. Denmark was being pressured to surrender sovereignty. Tariffs were being prepared against European economies. Military force was no longer being ruled out. The Atlantic Alliance was being treated less like a collective security pact and more like a hostile takeover negotiation. Carney never said Donald Trump's name. He didn't need to. Every person in that room knew exactly who he was talking about. Instead of attacking, he outlined an alternative. He described what Canada had been doing quietly but deliberately, increasing defense spending at a scale that signaled seriousness, accelerating trade and security agreements across multiple continents, deepening alignment with the European Union, building what he called strategic autonomy, not isolation, but the ability to absorb pressure without folding, the ability to say no without collapsing. Then he addressed Greenland directly. He stated clearly and without ambiguity that Canada supported Greenland and Denmark's right to determine their own future. He framed the situation as a test, not just of sovereignty, but of NATO itself. He reaffirmed Canada's commitment to collective defense. He rejected the legitimacy of tariff threats outright. The speech was calm, it was bilingual, it was precise, and it was devastating because it reframed the entire crisis. This wasn't about one territory or one leader's demands. It was about whether alliances still meant anything when pressure came from inside rather than outside. The reaction was immediate. European media called it one of the most important speeches delivered by a Western leader in years. Analysts praised its clarity. Diplomats privately admitted it said what they had been thinking but hadn't dared articulate publicly. Someone had finally described the moment honestly without panic or nostalgia. Less than a day later, the contrast became unavoidable. On Wednesday, Donald Trump stepped onto the same stage, same room, same audience, same global attention, and suddenly the posture changed. He opened the way he often does, mixing jokes with pointed remarks, signaling friendliness while reminding everyone who he believes holds the leverage. But when he turned to Greenland, something was off. The confidence was still there, but the momentum was gone. For weeks, the escalation had followed a familiar pattern. First, the claim of necessity, then the refusal to rule out force, then symbolic gestures designed for spectacle, then the appointment of envoys, then economic threats. Each step assumed the other side would blink. They didn't. Instead, Europe did something Trump had not anticipated. They closed ranks. Denmark stood firm. France and Germany backed them openly. Nordic countries coordinated. Joint military exercises were announced, not as provocation, but as deterrence. Even political factions that often align with Trump rejected the premise of his demands. By the time Trump arrived in Davos, the landscape had changed, and standing at that podium, he needed an exit. So he reached for the one move he always uses when pressure closes in. He declared victory. He announced what he called a framework, not an agreement, but the outline of one. He said tariffs would be paused. He spoke about cooperation, security, resources, future discussions. When pressed on ownership, his answers softened. Suddenly things were complicated, nuanced, under review. That word, complexity, mattered more than any headline. Because complexity is what you invoke when you're backing away from a demand you previously called non-negotiable. What actually happened wasn't diplomacy as triumph. It was confrontation meeting resistance. Trump had arrived demanding control. He left talking about cooperation. He had threatened force. He publicly removed it from the table. He had assumed isolation would work. He discovered unity was stronger. And that is where the real story begins. To understand why this mattered, you have to strip away the performance and look at the mechanics beneath it. Trump didn't arrive in Davos intending to compromise. He arrived believing escalation would force capitulation. The original demand was clear and explicit. Greenland would become American territory. Anything short of that was framed as unacceptable. Military options were floated. Economic retaliation was promised. The message was simple and deliberately intimidating. What Trump misjudged was not Denmark's resolve, but Europe's memory. European leaders understand history in a way American presidents often don't have to. They remember what happens when territorial claims are normalized. They remember what happens when powerful countries test boundaries and no one pushes back. So, instead of negotiating in private or signaling flexibility, they did something far more dangerous for Trump's strategy. They treated his threats as real. His troops were deployed to Greenland not as theater, but as insurance. Statements were issued not with ambiguity, but with precision. Sovereignty was described as non-negotiable. Article 5 was referenced openly. The implication was unmistakable. Any attempt to seize territory by force would not be treated as a bilateral dispute. It would be treated as an attack on the alliance itself. That changed the calculus overnight. Because behind every threat, is an assumption about consequences. Trump's assumption was that consequences would fall disproportionately on the other side. Instead, he was forced to confront a scenario where consequences would land squarely on the United States. A military confrontation with allies, the collapse of NATO, a rupture in trade relationships worth trillions, a shock to markets already sensitive to instability. There was no path forward that didn't end in damage. That's why the so-called framework appeared. It wasn't the product of leverage, it was the product of constraint. Diplomats recognize this pattern instantly. When maximalist demands quietly dissolve into vague cooperation language, it means the red lines were real. The Danish response made that clear. There was no celebration, no acknowledgement of concession, no validation of Trump's narrative, just a calm reiteration that fundamental principles were not up for negotiation. A subtle reminder that this is the 21st century, not an era of conquest. And this is where Mark Carney's speech becomes more than commentary. It becomes predictive. The day before Trump spoke, Carney had explained exactly why this outcome was likely. When powerful states abandon consistency in favor of transactional pressure, allies adapt. They don't submit. They diversify. They hedge. They coordinate. They build resilience, not against enemies, but against volatility. That's what Europe did. They didn't try to humiliate Trump. They didn't escalate rhetoric. They simply removed his leverage. By acting collectively, they made unilateral pressure ineffective. Denmark alone could have been isolated. Denmark, backed by France, Germany, the UK, and Canada, could not. This is the shift Carney was describing. Power no longer flows cleanly from size alone. It flows from coordination, legitimacy, and credibility. A superpower acting alone can still intimidate smaller states. A superpower confronting a unified bloc faces limits. That doesn't mean American power has vanished. It means it has conditions. For decades, the international system functioned because allies believed the United States would ultimately act with restraint. The benefits of alignment outweighed the risks. That belief is eroding. Not because America is weak, but because its unpredictability has increased the cost of dependence. Greenland exposed that tension in a way no policy paper ever could. Trump believed that pressure would fracture Europe. Instead, it consolidated it. His threats did more to strengthen European defense cooperation than years of speeches about strategic autonomy. His tariff warnings accelerated conversations about reducing reliance on American markets. His disregard for sovereignty made legal frameworks suddenly feel valuable again. This is the paradox of coercion. When used too aggressively, it teaches others how to resist it. Carney understood that dynamic. That's why his speech avoided nostalgia. He didn't argue for restoring the old order. He acknowledged its contradictions. He acknowledged that the post-war system often served the powerful first, but he also argued that abandoning it entirely doesn't lead to freedom. It leads to domination unless something replaces it. What replaces it, in his view, isn't a single new hegemon, it's networks, overlapping alliances, shared capabilities, collective responses that make coercion costly no matter who attempts it. Trump's worldview can't accommodate that. It depends on bilateral pressure, one-on-one negotiations where imbalance decides outcomes. That model fails when smaller players refuse to negotiate alone. That's what Davos revealed. Trump didn't lose because someone outmaneuvered him rhetorically. He lost because the environment changed around him. The tools he relies on still exist, but they no longer produce automatic compliance. The world is less forgiving of volatility, less tolerant of threats masquerading as strategy. Markets noticed this immediately. The moment tariffs were threatened, capital reacted, equity markets dipped, the dollar weakened, supply chain risk was repriced. When the framework was announced, there was a temporary rebound, but it was shallow. Investors understood that the underlying problem hadn't been resolved. Volatility is no longer an abstract concern. It has a cost. Companies don't expand when policy feels unstable. Partners don't commit when agreements feel provisional. Trust doesn't erode all at once. It degrades incrementally, then suddenly. European leaders grasped this clearly. Their response wasn't emotional, it was defensive. They weren't just protecting Denmark. They were protecting predictability, the idea that alliances aren't hostage to individual impulses. That's why voices across Europe echoed the same themes. Unity, sovereignty, mutual respect. not because they wanted confrontation, but because they recognized precedent. If Greenland could be pressured successfully, no territory was safe from transactional politics. Carney gave language to that anxiety. He reframed it as an opportunity rather than a crisis. A chance for middle powers to stop assuming stability will be provided externally and start building it collectively. That message landed because it offered agency, not defiance for its own sake, but coordination as self-preservation. And this is where Trump's declaration of victory rings hollow. He needed to claim success because retreat contradicts his brand. But outcomes matter more than announcements. Ownership was not achieved. Force was removed from the equation. Tariffs were delayed. The alliance held. That is not dominance. It is containment. And the most significant consequence isn't what happened this week. It's what happens next time. Because precedent shapes behavior. Europe now knows unity works. NATO allies have seen that collective resolve can deter pressure even from within. Middle powers have learned that alignment isn't symbolic. It's practical. That knowledge doesn't disappear. Trump may try again. In fact, history suggests he probably will. Leaders who feel constrained often seek a moment to reassert control. But the environment he's operating in is different now. Resistance is no longer hypothetical. That's the rupture Carney described, not chaos, but recalibration. A world where power still exists but is less absolute, where demands meet conditions, where intimidation meets coordination. And that shift is only beginning.